We're now on the final leg of the top 100 storm countdown this hurricane week. These are the top 20 that I've selected based on a number of criteria. For this reason, you may or may not agree with this selection. Storm number 20 was one of the strongest hurricanes ever seen in the Atlantic Ocean, achieving a minimum central pressure of 888 millibars in the Western Caribbean, causing hundreds of deaths and billions of dollars of damage. This was Hurricane Gilbert.
Gilbert formed on approach to the Lesser Antilles and struck Martinique as a tropical storm. Gilbert then became a hurricane and quickly a major hurricane as it approached Jamaica, making landfall on the southern side of the island. This didn't affect the storm though, and Gilbert went on to reach Category 5 intensity in the Western Caribbean, making landfall on Cozumel and the Yucatan Peninsula as a Category 5 storm. This did weaken Gilbert, but he strengthened again to a Category 4 storm before hitting northern Mexico. The island of Hispaniola was hit by flooding, particularly in Haiti where rough waves caused some coastal damage. A large storm surge hit Jamaica, with Gilbert's rain and winds causing mudslide and flooding, damaging transport, power and communications links. Agricultural damages amounted to $500 million. Flooding continued in Mexico, with storm surge pushing a number of miles into the Yucatan Peninsula. Gilbert set an Atlantic low-pressure record of 888 millibars, which would be eclipsed 17 years later.
At 19 was a storm that devastated the Dominican Republic, making landfall as a high-end Category 4 storm in September 1930. As a result, many thousands died as parts of the capital city of Santo Domingo were flattened. This storm was known as the Dominican Republic Hurricane of 1930.
This storm formed in the central Atlantic, becoming a hurricane on approach to the Lesser Antilles, moving directly over the island of Dominica. The hurricane then intensified and struck the Dominican Republic as a Category 4 storm. Weakening to a tropical storm, it then moved west and struck the western tip of Cuba and then central Florida, becoming a hurricane once more as it approached the North Carolina Outer Banks. The storm dissipated near the Azores. In Dominica there was significant agricultural damage and many ships were destroyed. Santo Domingo was heavily damaged due to winds of up to 150 miles per hour, destroying around half of the entire city. The death toll is unknown, but estimates vary from 2 to 8,000.
Storm 18 is perhaps the storm that southern Florida remembers the most. Being one of the costliest hurricanes in the Atlantic, this storm hit Homestead as a Category 5 storm before moving on to Louisiana, where it made landfall as a weakening Category 3 hurricane. This was Hurricane Andrew.
Andrew formed in the central Atlantic and moved northwest, becoming a hurricane as it turned west halfway between Puerto Rico and Bermuda. Andrew then intensified, quickly becoming a Category 5 storm on approach to the Bahamas, making landfall on Eleuthera Island with winds of 160 miles per hour. Weakening to a Category 4 storm, Andrew skimmed the tip of Andros Island and aimed for southern Florida. Andrew then made landfall on Elliott Key and at Homestead as a Category 5 storm. Andrew then weakened to a Category 4 storm, right up until landfall in Louisiana, where it rapidly weakened and eventually dissipated. A substantial storm surge arrived with the Category 5 storm in the Bahamas, killing only 3 thanks to warnings more than a day in advance. More than 1 million were evacuated in Florida, damaging or destroying nearly 150,000 buildings, as well as 3,300 miles of power lines. That's the distance from Miami to southern Alaska. 15 direct fatalities resulted. In Louisiana, roofs were damaged and a number of trees were downed. However, the hurricane still managed to destroy nearly 1,000 homes in the state. In total, damages amounted to nearly $27 billion at the time.
At 17 is the only Category 5 hurricane ever recorded in the month of November and caused severe damage in the Cayman Islands and in Cuba. With over 3,000 deaths, the Cuba hurricane of 1932 was amongst the most deadly.
This storm formed to the east of the Lesser Antilles, passing the northern tip of Martinique as it became a tropical storm. The storm reached hurricane status to the north of Venezuela and moved close to its north coast whilst continuing to intensify. The hurricane reached Category 5 status in the central Caribbean and slowly curved towards the north and weakened to a Category 4 storm as it passed close to the Cayman Islands. The storm struck Cuba as a Category 4 storm, passing through the Bahamas and passing close to Bermuda on its way north. A storm surge of up to 10 metres devastated the Cayman Islands, with a surge of 7 metres striking Cuba, decimating a number of coastal towns. In total, there were over 3,100 fatalities.
Storm 16 was a deadly hurricane that made landfall in Guadeloupe in 1776, though its strength was unknown. What we do know is that over 6,000 were killed and many ships were sunk as a result. This storm is best known as the Pointe-á-Pitre Hurricane.
This storm was most notable for its landfall in Guadeloupe, where 6,000 people perished. This was the highest death toll recorded for 4 years, until the Great Hurricane of 1780 arrived.
At 15 was perhaps one of the deadliest typhoons in history, striking Vietnam in 1881. What is known as the Haiphong Typhoon killed up to 300,000 people. Nothing is known about its tracking intensity, so this animation may be an inaccurate reconstruction. Storm 14 was a deadly Atlantic hurricane which stalled over Cuba for 3 whole days before moving back out to sea. Haiti and Jamaica also suffered badly from the storm's rainfall, which was the most Haiti had ever received from a storm. This was Hurricane Flora.
Flora formed in the central Atlantic and became a tropical storm to the north of South America and had become a major hurricane by the time it moved directly over Tobago. Florida continued to intensify, becoming a Category 4 hurricane for a lengthy period cut short by its landfall in Haiti. Flora then struck Cuba as a major hurricane and began to weaken over land. Appearing on the other side of Cuba as a Category 2 storm, Flora stalled and weakened to a Category 1 storm before moving back over the island and then finally began accelerating away. Flora became a major hurricane once more on its closest approach to Bermuda and became extratropical to the southeast of Newfoundland. On Tobago, a third of homes were destroyed and more than 3/4 of forest was destroyed. Rainfall from Flora was historic, with Haiti reaching 57 inches of rain, 3 times more than any other storm. Damages in Haiti were severe, killing around 5,000, whilst in Cuba major erosion and storm surge swept away houses and transport links.
At 13 was a storm that caused complete destruction in parts of Barbados and caused damage on neighbouring islands, Haiti and Cuba. This was the Barbados Hurricane of 1831.
This storm formed somewhere over the open Atlantic and struck Barbados, destroying most of the buildings on the island. Similar destruction occurred over parts of coastal Haiti and Cuba. The storm then went on to make landfall in Louisiana, causing flooding in parts of New Orleans. A total of 2,500 people were killed as a result of the storm.
Storm 12 was another devastating hurricane, one that struck Puerto Rico as a Category 5 storm. However, a large part of the death toll was due to the hurricane's landfall in southern Florida, where there was a major storm surge and Category 4 winds. The storm was the Okeechobee Hurricane of 1928.
This storm formed pretty much as soon as it left the African coast, becoming a tropical storm between Africa and the Cape Verde Islands. The storm became a hurricane in the central Atlantic and was already a Category 4 storm by the time it struck Guadeloupe. Then reaching Category 5 status, the hurricane made landfall over Puerto Rico, then hugged the north coast of the Dominican Republic before moving through the Bahamas as a Category 4 storm. It maintained this intensity until landfall in Florida, moving over Lake Okeechobee, and then curving northeast, briefly emerging over the Atlantic once more, still as a hurricane. 1,200 fatalities were reported in Guadeloupe, but the worst of the storm hit Puerto Rico. However, preparations for the storm were well taken, leading to a comparatively low death toll of 312. Catastrophic damage still resulted though, with nearly 25,000 homes destroyed and a further 192,000 damaged. Heavy damage was also recorded in Grand Bahama, with nobody killed on land. However, a ship was lost at sea with 18 on board. Heavy damage was reported in the Palm Beach area, though there were only 26 fatalities along the coast. Most of Florida's 2,500 deaths occurred around Lake Okeechobee, which severely overflowed due to storm surge, flooding hundreds of square miles and washing away bodies into the Everglades. The total death toll from the storm was at least 4,000.
At 11 was another ferocious and deadly Atlantic hurricane. Over the course of 31 days, this storm was a major hurricane for well over a week, striking the Leeward Islands, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, the Turks and Caicos Islands, the Bahamas and the United States in the process. This was the Ciriaco Hurricane of 1899.
This storm formed to the southwest of the Cape Verde Islands and developed into a hurricane over the central Atlantic, reaching Category 4 strength when it struck Guadeloupe, then Puerto Rico. The storm remained at Category 3 intensity as it paralleled the coast of the Dominican Republic and cruised through the Bahamas, staying a few hundred miles from the US coast as it curved northeastwards. However, the storm began to turn back to the northwest and moved over the Outer Banks and into Virginia as a weakening storm. After stalling just offshore, the storm moved away as a hurricane before becoming extratropical south of Nova Scotia. The system became a tropical storm once more over open waters and eventually became a hurricane for the final time near the Azores, becoming the longest lasting storm in the Atlantic. Due to heavy rainfall, at least 3,400 people died in Puerto Rico as a result of the storm.
Now we enter the top 10. These are the 10 storms that I feel are the most notable. Bear in mind that these storms aren't decided on a single factor such as intensity, cost or death toll, but rather a blend of all these factors and more. Storm number 10 was a short-lived typhoon that still managed to reach super typhoon status before slamming into Taiwan in 1975. However, the worst of the damage was in China after the typhoon weakened to a tropical storm. This was Typhoon Nina.
Nina formed in the open Pacific and dipped southward before moving northwest as a tropical storm. Nina quickly became a typhoon and continued to strengthen into a Category 4 storm, striking Taiwan as a Category 3 storm. Nina then went on to strike China as a tropical storm before tracking inland as a depression. 115 mph winds battered Taiwan, with flooding and landslides destroying 3,000 homes and causing 29 fatalities. However, the biggest consequences of the storm were felt in China, where severe rainfall over a wide area caused over 60 inches in total in some areas, 62 dams failed, and 229,000 drowned as a result.
At 9 was a very deadly hurricane and one that will always be remembered in the US state of Texas. The city of Galveston was devastated when the storm surge completely submerged the island, killing thousands. This, of course, was the Galveston Hurricane of 1900.
This storm formed in the central Atlantic and remained a tropical storm as it passed through the Leeward Islands, passing just south of Puerto Rico and making landfall on the Dominican Republic. The storm then moved over Haiti and Cuba and finally reached hurricane status near Key West. The hurricane then went on to reach Category 4 strength, which it maintained until its landfall in Texas. Forecasters in the United States predicted that the storm would strike Florida and move out to sea, whilst Cuban forecasters predicted that the storm would strike Texas. This would result in a smaller warning period and many people unprepared in Galveston. The hurricane storm surge was the biggest feature, swamping the whole of Galveston Island, with a surge a whole 6 feet above Galveston's highest point. 4,000 or more buildings were destroyed due to the surge, waves and winds of 120 miles per hour. Communication lines were destroyed, with word only reaching Houston more than a full day after the storm. The total death toll is estimated to be between 6 and 12,000.
Storm 8 was a monstrous Category 5 storm that was the deadliest in recent times. Attaining and maintaining Category 5 status for 2 days in the Caribbean Sea, Hurricane Mitch then went on to strike Honduras, causing extreme rainfall and thousands of deaths overnight.
Mitch formed in the southern Caribbean, becoming a tropical storm as it slowly progressed north, and then a hurricane in the open sea. The storm quickly intensified, reaching Category 5 status as it approached the coast of Central America. Straying to the north of the Honduran coast, Mitch retained its intensity until it began to curve to the south towards land. The storm stalled and slowly weakened to a Category 1 storm where it made a slow-paced landfall. Mitch then weakened and eventually became a remnant low, but regenerated near the Yucatan Peninsula. Mitch then went on to strike Florida as a tropical storm before quickly becoming extratropical. Extreme rainfall was the main factor in Mitch, with 2/3 of the year's average falling in Honduras. Mudslides were a common result, with 3/4 of the country's transport links completely destroyed. 7,000 were killed and more than 1 million were left homeless. Nicaragua suffered a similar fate, with 40,000 homes damaged or destroyed, and 450 essential service buildings such as schools and hospitals severely damaged. Only 3 in 10 roads remained passable, and nearly 4,000 were killed in the country. Flooding and heavy rains were also reported in other Central American countries, with a total death toll of over 19,000.
At number 7 was another exceptionally deadly cyclone that remains the worst natural disaster in Burma's history. Striking the south of the country as a Category 4 storm, Cyclone Nargis caused $10 billion of damage and over 100,000 fatalities.
Nargis formed in the central Bay of Bengal and reached hurricane strength as it began to move northeast. Eventually, the storm began to intensify further, becoming a Category 4 storm by the time it made landfall in Burma. Catastrophe ensued, with thousands dead or missing. Burma's military rulers initially refused aid from other countries, but eventually accepted after a critical few days of delay. Many more deaths were feared due to the spread of diseases, but thankfully the threat remained at bay. However, nearly 140,000 were killed as a result of the storm.
Storm 6 was another cyclone that formed in the Bay of Bengal and went on to strike Bangladesh as a Category 5 storm in April 1991. This storm is best known as the Bangladesh Cyclone.
This storm formed to the southwest of the Andaman Islands and slowly moved northwest, becoming a tropical storm, and attained hurricane force winds shortly after turning north. The cyclone continued to intensify, eventually becoming a Category 5 cyclone before striking Bangladesh. 2 million evacuated, and many who didn't were killed as a result of the cyclone's devastating storm surge. Almost 140,000 were killed in the storm.
At 5 was the most intense storm in the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season. With an almost unprecedented intensification rate, this storm topped out with 185 mph winds and an air pressure of 882 millibars, the lowest ever seen in the Atlantic. This storm also caused almost $30 billion of damage, this being Hurricane Wilma.
Wilma formed near Jamaica, initially moving slowly west, then moving south as a tropical storm. Changing direction again, Wilma became a hurricane and started to explosively intensify into a Category 5 storm in less than a day. Wilma then reached its record peak before weakening to a Category 4 storm, which it maintained until striking Cozumel and the Yucatan Peninsula. Wilma remained a Category 2 storm as it moved northeast, briefly reaching major hurricane strength before striking Florida. Re-attaining Category 3 intensity for the third time, Wilma swiftly advanced northeast and became extratropical. Mudslides killed 12 in Haiti. Cozumel and Cancun reported major damage along with flooding, with the total cost in Mexico reaching over $7 billion. South Florida reported extensive damage due to winds and flooding, with around 6 million left without power. 23 direct fatalities were attributed to the storm.
Storm 4 is perhaps the deadliest cyclone of all time, striking what was then known as East Pakistan in 1970. The Bhola Cyclone killed over 300,000 people when it made landfall that November.
This storm formed somewhere in the central Bay of Bengal and proceeded north. The storm likely intensified without interruption, reaching Category 3 strength near the time of landfall. A surge of around 10 metres was reported near the landfall area, completely decimating a number of islands around the Ganges Delta, with no survivors reported. Coastal regions were said to have been almost completely destroyed, with a death toll in the region of 300 to 500,000.
At 3 is a historic storm that was perhaps both the deadliest and the strongest in the Atlantic, decimating the Lesser and part of the Greater Antilles. The Great Hurricane of 1780 is best known for its death toll, at least 20,000.
A likely Cape Verde type system, this was a strong hurricane by the time it passed over Barbados. The storm then moved northeast, passing St. Lucia and then passing the islands of Dominica, Martinique and Guadeloupe. The storm then moved on to Puerto Rico, passing just to the southwest, and then made landfall on the northern coast of the Dominican Republic. It is likely that the storm then moved north-northwest, passing to the east of Grand Turk Island, and then curving out to sea. On the island of Barbados, not a single building or tree remained standing, with winds estimated to be up to 200 miles per hour at the height of the storm. Most buildings were destroyed in St. Vincent's capital, Kingstown. Heavy damage was reported in the other areas affected. In total, 20,000 or more people died as a result of the storm.
If you ask anyone who lives in a non-tropical region, here in the UK being a good example, most people would say that the hurricane they are most aware of is Hurricane Katrina. This storm caused catastrophic flooding in New Orleans and major damage elsewhere in Louisiana and in Mississippi. This is storm number 2 in my top 100.
Katrina formed over the Bahamas and became a tropical storm as it progressed northwest, curving to the west towards Florida. Katrina struck the Florida coast as a hurricane, intensifying upon leaving the state. The storm soon attained major hurricane status and then became a Category 5 storm in the central Gulf of Mexico. Katrina then homed in on eastern Louisiana, making landfall there whilst heading north as a Category 3 storm. Katrina then weakened and degenerated into a low well inland. Katrina caused heavy rainfall in parts of Florida, causing widespread power outages and 14 fatalities. Katrina's storm surge was the main feature of the storm, breaching numerous levees in New Orleans, resulting in the flooding of most of the city. The surge also caused significant flooding to coastal areas of Louisiana, Mississippi, and the Florida Panhandle. Katrina was responsible for 1,833 fatalities and $108 billion of damages, remaining as one of the most notable storms of all time.
In meteorological circles, this next storm is generally regarded as the beast of all beasts. With a wind diameter of nearly 1,500 miles, a wind speed of 190 miles per hour, and a record smashing air pressure of 870 millibars, Typhoon Tip of 1979 makes it to number 1 in my top 100.
Tip formed in the Micronesian region, and after moving erratically for a short while, the storm made its mind up on direction and moved northwest, curving gradually to the west. Tip passed just to the south of Guam and then became a typhoon, strengthening for over a day until it reached Category 5 status and its record low pressure. Tip moved slowly to the northwest, then back to the west, weakening to a Category 4 storm. It maintained that strength for a time before beginning to weaken further, passing Okinawa as a Category 2 storm and striking mainland Japan as a Category 1 typhoon. Flooding and mudslides in Japan resulted in the deaths of 42 on land and 44 at sea, with a fire causing 13 indirect fatalities. Tip's wind field measured nearly 1,400 miles wide, equivalent to half the size of the continental United States, or slightly more than the distance from Taipei to Tokyo. This concludes the fifth and final part of Force 13's Top 100 Storms. Next up is the featured full season animation, which happens to be the most busiest season ever recorded in the world, the 1964 Pacific Typhoon season animation. Tomorrow marks the last part of Hurricane Week, where I'll be answering any questions that you the viewer may have submitted during this week. If you have a question, just comment below this video. For those of you watching this as I upload them, part 6 will be out tomorrow. For the rest of you, it should be around here somewhere.